A major fight is happening inside Catholic circles, and at the center of it is one question. Can the Old Covenant still save people without Jesus Christ? George Weigel recently criticized the Society of St. Pius X, or SSPX. But according to writer Riaan Van Zyl, that attack says more about Weigel's theology than it does about the SSPX. Van Zyl argues that Weigel is not defending traditional Catholic teaching. Instead, he believes Weigel is defending ideas that became popular after the Second Vatican Council. The controversy began when Weigel accused SSPX leaders of effectively declaring that they do not share the faith of the Catholic Church. His criticism focused on one SSPX statement. The SSPX said that Jesus Christ rendered the Old Covenant definitively null and void. Weigel claimed that such a statement would have shocked St. Paul. But Van Zyl strongly disagrees. He argues that the SSPX did not invent this teaching. According to him, it reflects centuries of Catholic doctrine. He points to the Council of Florence, which taught that the legal observances of the Old Testament could not continue after the gospel without risking eternal salvation. Van Zyl says Catholic theology has traditionally taught that the Mosaic covenant was fulfilled and replaced by Christ. He also points to the Epistle to the Hebrews. That letter describes Christ as the mediator of a new covenant and says the first covenant became obsolete. Van Zyl notes that Jesus established the new covenant through his blood. He also cites St. Thomas Aquinas, who taught that the ceremonial laws of the Old Testament became spiritually dead after Christ's passion. For Van Zyl, the SSPX is simply repeating a traditional Catholic interpretation that existed long before modern debates. He then turns to Weigel's use of Romans chapters 9 and 11. Weigel argues that because God's gifts and calling are irrevocable, the Old Covenant remains in force. Van Zyl says this interpretation ignores the broader message of St. Paul. He argues that St. Paul consistently teaches that God's promises are fulfilled in Christ. The same apostle who wrote Romans 11 also taught that there is neither Jew nor Greek because all are one in Christ. Van Zyl points out that St. Paul expressed deep sorrow because many Jews had not accepted Jesus as the Messiah. If the Mosaic covenant remained sufficient for salvation, Van Zyl argues, Paul's sorrow would make little sense. According to Van Zyl, Romans 9 through 11 is not teaching two separate paths to salvation. Instead, it teaches that God remained faithful to his promises by fulfilling them through Jesus Christ. He also cites several historical Catholic commentators. St. Augustine saw Romans 11 as predicting a future conversion of the Jewish people. St. John Chrysostom interpreted the passage in a similar way. Jesuit scholar Father Cornelius a Lapide also taught that God's plan was ultimately to bring the Jewish people to Christ. Van Zyl argues that these interpretations dominated Catholic theology for centuries. He also notes that St. Paul taught salvation comes through faith in Christ. In Romans 10, Paul writes that anyone who confesses Jesus as Lord and believes in his resurrection will be saved. Paul also asks how people can believe if they have never heard the gospel. For Van Zyl, this shows why the Church historically preached Christ to Jews as well as Gentiles. The debate then moves to another controversial topic, the doctrine that there is no salvation outside the Catholic Church. Weigel criticized the SSPX for defending this teaching. Van Zyl responds by citing several church councils and papal statements. He points to the Fourth Lateran Council, which taught that outside the Church no one is saved. He cites Pope Boniface VIII's document Unam Sanctum. He also references the Council of Florence, which taught that pagans, Jews, heretics, and schismatics must be united to the Church before death. Van Zyl argues that even Blessed Pius IX maintained this teaching while acknowledging that God can work through invincible ignorance. Another major disagreement concerns Vatican II. Van Zyl believes Weigel treats Vatican II as the final standard for Catholic orthodoxy. He rejects that approach completely. He argues that traditional Catholic theology should remain the standard for judging theological questions. The article concludes with a discussion about accusations of antisemitism. Weigel connected Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre and the SSPX to elements of France's Vichy regime during World War II. Van Zyl rejects this comparison. He argues that traditional Catholic teaching about Judaism was based on religious beliefs, not race. He points to St. Peter and St. Paul, both of whom preached conversion to Christ without hatred toward Jews. In the end, Van Zyl says the real issue is much larger than one article. He believes the SSPX is defending teachings that Catholics accepted for centuries, and he argues that the deeper conflict is not between Weigel and the SSPX. It is between traditional Catholic theology and the theological changes that emerged after the Second Vatican Council.